All right, good evening. If you'll take your Bibles, please, and we'll turn to the book of Daniel. That's sweet, it's working. All right, the book of Daniel. We'll start out and we'll read the first 4 verses. And the Bible says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well-favored and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and as such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans." So here we have the book introduction to the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel is an incredible book in the Old Testament. It's made up of historical narrative and yet prophecy, and its significance cannot be overstated. Because during this time, he would eventually give hope and encouragement to the exiles as they were in the land of Babylon. And he gave witness and testimony of the God of Israel to the nations that surrounded them who did not believe in the God of Israel at that time. And to us, Daniel gives insight and clarification to the prophecies we find in the New Testament. So imagine not having the book of Daniel, having no knowledge of it, and trying to piece together the verses that we find in Matthew of the Discourse Olivet that Jesus gave, and of course, John the Revelator as he gives out those prophecies. That would be extremely difficult for us without Daniel. Charles Feinberg said this about Daniel: "The book of Daniel is unquestionably the key to all biblical prophecy. It is the great apocalyptic book of the Old Testament, whereas Revelation is that of the New Testament. Passages such as Matthew 24:25, Mark 13, Luke 21, and the book of Revelation itself are unintelligible without the knowledge of the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is a perpetual gold mine of knowledge concerning the nature of God, practical living for man, and the ever-present spiritual warfare that followers of God have always faced and will continue to face until the return of our Lord." And so here, as we get into the introduction, we'll cover the first thing we need to discuss. In these first 4 verses, there is a lot. And really, we need to go over, before we can understand these first 4 verses, there is this historical background that's packed into there. And the 4 points that we'll cover for the historical background is the Lord's covenant with Israel is the first point that we need to understand. And then there's 2 empires mainly that lead up to Daniel, the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And then we'll discuss a little bit about Daniel's contemporaries, because he was not the only prophet during this time. Sometimes it's the way that the prophets are laid out in the Old Testament don't lend to that understanding. So we'll look at some of his contemporaries. So let's first look at the Lord's covenant with Israel. All right, so we're going to leave Daniel for a little bit. We will come back at the very end. But first, let's turn over to the book of Deuteronomy. And specifically, Deuteronomy chapter number 30 is what we'll look at. Now, if you go back, we will not even attempt to read them, because Deuteronomy 28 is 68 verses long, and 29 is 29 verses long, and it is Moses giving to the children of Israel the blessings and cursings that follow the covenant that God is making with the children of Israel. And the curses are much longer than the blessings if you go and read it. And chapter 30, verse 1, gives us an interesting detail into that. So, and it says, "And it shall come to pass, when all these things are come upon thee, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before thee, and thou shalt call them to mind among all the nations whither the Lord thy God hath driven thee. It's interesting here in this first verse that as they're talking to the children of Israel, he says, and it shall come to pass when all these things are come upon thee. God knew what the children of Israel were going to do even before they did it. You know, they all agreed after hearing the blessings, the cursings, the covenant. They said, yes, we're with you, Moses. We will obey. That is not a problem. We will follow through. And as we know the history of the Old Testament, they did not follow through on all that they said that they were going to do. But the Lord's covenant here, and because of that, God knew exactly what was going to happen. And because it was his covenant, it was his promise that he made, he was going to uphold that. And he was not going to just let them get away with whatever sin they decided was better than following him. And so the Lord's covenant is really where this starts with the nation of Israel. This is why these things happen to the nation of Israel, why these foreign enemies are allowed to come in and to conquer them. So this is critical to understanding why these foreign nations are allowed to come in. So they are allowed to come in. However, that does not mean that this is the end. If we keep reading in verse 2, and thou shalt return unto the Lord thy God, and shall obey his voice according to all that I command thee this day, thou and thy children with all thy heart and with all thy soul. That then the Lord thy God will turn thy captivity and have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all the nations whither the Lord thy God hath scattered thee. Even before it even happens, God is laying out in this covenant. He goes, look, you are going to sin. You are going to fall away from me. But within this covenant that I've made, there is going to be a way back as well. It is not the final say-so when I have to discipline you with these other nations. And so now we have the covenant with Israel that we've made. Now, let's look first at the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire, the Lord used the Assyrians to judge the 10 northern tribes of Israel. They had, of course, when the kingdoms split and after Solomon had passed away, they went into total rebellion. There wasn't really a good king among the northern tribes. They were all very much, even the Bible says, sometimes they were even worse than the nations that were around them. So in 722 BC, the Assyrians destroyed the city of Samaria. They went through and they knocked out the northern 10 tribes. Turn to 2 Kings chapter 17. We'll look at some of these. 2 Kings 17 gives the story of this. And so 2 Kings 17 and verse number 5. We'll start here. We'll just hit a few key verses. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Syria and placed them in Halah and in Habor by the river Gozan and in the city of the Medes. For it was so that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, which had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and feared other gods, and walked in the statutes of the heathen, whom the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel, and of the kings of Israel, which they had made. And so here they totally destroyed them. Now, Assyria is going to be important. This kind of shows the map. And, of course, we have Babylon down in the south, and then Assyria is a little up north. And you'll see Nineveh, and you'll see, obviously, it goes all the way around the Arabian Desert. And so Assyria was really the first empire to, when they took land, and they would try to keep it. And so, obviously, Assyria came up with a great idea. The way that they could keep it was through insane amounts of fear and tyranny and torture. Whatever means they could is how they kept their captors in line. And another thing that they practiced, which will be important later on in the story of Daniel, would be expatriation. They would take those captives and they would go and displace them in a totally different country and a totally different people, and they would switch. And the idea was that they wouldn't get any ideas of rebellion in their own land. and they would be so distraught they wouldn't even think about rebelling against the Assyrians. And this worked in the short term, but this would not work in the long term. And when we come and we finally make our way to the Medo-Persian Empire, they're going to reverse that. They're going to reverse that. But of course, we will get to that later. But keep that in mind. That's kind of what they did, and Babylon will follow that, and will basically follow that as well. And so here we have the large Assyrian Empire. And now, of course, the Assyrians tried to, once they got Samaria, of course, they set their eyes south to go to Jerusalem. They're like, well, we're here. We are going to take them as well. We've conquered everyone else. How hard could Jerusalem be? And so you're in 2 Kings 17. Flip over to 2 Kings 18 and 19. Obviously, again, chapters 18 and 19 tell the whole story of the Assyrians coming and knocking on the Jerusalem gate and saying, we're coming, and there's nothing you can do about it. But on the other hand, God had different ideas. It wasn't time for Jerusalem to go into captivity just yet. And so he is not, God spared Jerusalem and Judah at this point. So if you look at 2 Kings chapter 19, and then in verse 32. Therefore, thus saith the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into the city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shield, nor cast a blank against it. By the way that it came, by the same shall he return, and shall not come into this city, saith the Lord. For I will defend the city to save it, for mine own sake, and for my servant David's sake. And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they rose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer his son smote him with the sword, and they escaped in the land of Armenia. And Esarhaddon his son reigned in his stead. So Assyria was stopped there at Jerusalem. The Lord intervened and allowed Jerusalem and Judah to survive. And even when they went and they discovered the city of Nineveh, and they were looking at their records, it's interesting to note that Jerusalem is not mentioned in their records. They don't take any mention of it at all. They mention another major city in the land. It's in the land of Judah. It's not in Israel. It's in the land of Judah, but it was the city right before Jerusalem that they captured, and they wrote about that. And that was as far as their testimony goes. And so that is Assyria. Now, so and here's 722. Assyria destroyed the city of Samaria, and of course God defended them. Now we come to good old Babylon. And so the Lord will use Babylon to judge both Assyria and the tribe of Judah. Now, Assyria took their job a little too seriously when it came to judging other nations. They were insanely cruel about the way that they went and conquered other nations, and God recognized that, and he said that he was going to go and judge the nation of Assyria. They were not going to get away with their crimes. And so here, and obviously, you can read about that. I believe it's the book of Nahum that deals with the judgment of Assyria. And so Babylon is going to be raised in order to do this. So we have Nebuchadnezzar. He is the crown prince, and his father sent him to go battle Assyria as Assyria was in decline. And basically, the map that we showed you before, Babylon is going to take all of that and just a little bit more. They're going to follow their same path right around the Arabian desert and right down the coastline, all the way down even into Egypt. So Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Nineveh around 612 BC, and he utterly destroyed it. There was nothing left. Archaeologists didn't even know it existed until it was found by British archaeologists. Oh, this actually might be Nineveh. And so then after that, sometime between destroying Nineveh and his next battle, Nebuchadnezzar's father passed away. He had to hurry back to Babylon proper and establish himself as indeed the very next king and empire. And so he had to do that. But while he was doing that, Assyria was regathering their army, regathering their troops, including the nation of Egypt, in which they had formed an alliance. And so this story we can find in 2 Chronicles chapter number 35. We'll look at that briefly. 2 Chronicles 35. So they are gathering together, and Egypt is making its way north, and it's going to be at the Battle of Carchemish. So Egypt is making its way north, and of course, in order for Egypt to get up there, they have to go through the land of Judah. And as they're going through the land of Judah, Josiah does not like Egypt being there, and it's not going to turn out in his favor. 2 Chronicles 35 and verse number 20. After all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, remember he had set in all these reforms, he had turned back to following the Lord, he even included the Passover, which had not been kept in quite a while in Judah. So he was doing well. And then Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Carchemish by the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. But he, that is Necho, sent ambassadors to him, that is Josiah, saying, "What have I to do with thee, thou king of Judah? I come not against thee this day, but against the house wherein I have war. For God commanded me to make haste. Forbear thee from meddling with God, who is with me, that he destroy thee not." So Josiah had gathered his armies together as Egypt was making their way north, and he decided he didn't want Egypt in there for whatever reason. Text doesn't really give us a reason what his purpose was in this. And Necho said, don't do it. Like, I don't have anything against you. I'm going somewhere else. Just let me pass through. And Josiah presses, and it does not turn out well. Verse 22, "Nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from him, but disguised himself that he might fight with him, and hearkened not unto the words of Necho from the mouth of God, and came to fight in the valley of Megiddo. And the archer shot at King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, Have me away, for I am sore wounded. His servants therefore took him out of the chariot and put him in the second chariot that he had, and brought him to Jerusalem, and he died, and was buried in one of the sepulchres of his fathers. And all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah, and rightly so, for he will be the last good king that Judah has. And now the rest of the acts of Josiah and his goodness, according to all that which was written in the law of the Lord, with his deeds and his last, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. So, unfortunately, Josiah loses his life. They lose the battle. Egypt comes in, deals with them for just a little bit before moving on to their main objective, which of course leaves the royal family in Judah in just a downward spiral for the rest of their history. But at Carchemish, even though Necho thought he was doing the right thing when he came, Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar was victorious. He totally, again, defeated the Assyrian Empire, and Assyria just kind of dispersed into the other nations. You don't really read about them once anymore. And he even chased the Egyptians all the way down to Egypt themselves. And Egypt really doesn't make much more headway after that. So he totally conquers them. And on the way back, Nebuchadnezzar will indeed take Jerusalem. And he will take the first exiles back to Babylon. And that'll be around 605, 604 BC. And if you're still in 2 Chronicles, if you look at verse 36, verses 6 through 10. Against him came up Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and bound him in fetters and carried him to Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar also carried of the vessels of the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in his temple at Babylon, which is what we read in the book of Daniel. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and his abominations which he did, which are found in him, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel of Judah, and Jehoiachin his son reigned at his stead. And of course, Jehoiachin was 8 years old when he began to reign, and reigned 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem, and he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. And when the year was expired, King Nebuchadnezzar sent and brought him to Babylon with the goodly vessels of the house of the Lord, and made Zedekiah his brother king over Judah and Jerusalem. So now Babylon has established their authority in the Middle East. They are now the reigning empire. There is no one left to really stop them at this point. And they have made at least 2 excursions from Jerusalem all the way over into Babylon. And in one of these excursions, we find Daniel. We find the princes that he took back. And of course, he set up a puppet king there in Jerusalem, which will not go well for Jerusalem. Eventually, he will come back in one of his excursions to destroy the city itself. Now, during this, Daniel has two main contemporaries in the Old Testament that are writing at the same time as him. Jeremiah, of course, and he has remained in Jerusalem, and of course, he witnesses the eventual destruction of the city. They refuse to listen to his message of just submit to Babylon. This is already of God. God has this planned out. Just submit, and you'll be saved. The city will be saved. Of course, they don't listen. They keep pushing the envelope, and Nebuchadnezzar loses his patience and just comes and just wipes them out and destroys the city and the temple entirely. And of course, Jeremiah records this and in Lamentations. Ezekiel was a priest, and he was also exiled in Babylon the same time as Daniel. And so it's interesting whether or not they ever met or talked or had conversations. We have no idea, but they were definitely there in the same time. So we have the contemporaries with him. I don't know how well you can see this. Fairly decently, I think. So this kind of just gives a general overview of the biblical timeline, and you can kind of see where it goes. And of course, we are at Daniel. Daniel's going to be about around 605 to when he's deported to around 520, we think is the time frame that Daniel lives. And then, of course, he's going to see Babylon, and then he's going to see the Medo-Persia Empire eventually as well. So let's get into the major theological themes. What do we see in the book of Daniel? What major things pop out? The very first thing that we're going to see is God's sovereignty. He was always in charge, and he will always be in charge. He hasn't let his creation go. Everything that happens in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and all the way up to modern times, God is in charge. Next, we're going to see faithful living under oppression. We'll see several, as we'll get to the outline of Daniel, and we'll see the very first 6 chapters will be Daniel and his friends dealing with living in Babylon. And they chose faithful living over subjection. Next, wisdom to navigate life's challenges. Daniel had several challenges that he had to face. And there were several times his life was even in danger for it, but nonetheless, God gave him wisdom to navigate those things. Daniel himself, obviously, he will even say continuously, it is the Lord who gives me these things. It's not of my own. The next theme we'll see is God's judgment of man's pride. Pride is one of the things that continuously we see in the Bible that God absolutely hates, and he takes care of it rather quickly. And we'll see that in the nations of Babylon, even in these Gentile nations. And next, we'll see God's coming kingdom. It's not over. God has promised a kingdom, and it will eventually come. And Daniel is one of those, as we'll see. God gives him some insight into the last things, and it's a hope specifically for the exiles, for the nation of Israel. It's not over for them. It may not happen in their lifetime, but it is coming. God's promises will indeed be kept. So let's look at the outline for the book of Daniel. This outline divides practically in half. We have chapters 1 through 6 are historical narrative. Chapter 1, we have the introduction to Babylon. And then 2, we have Nebuchadnezzar's first dream. Chapter 3 is Nebuchadnezzar and his golden statue and the fiery furnace. We have Nebuchadnezzar's second dream in chapter 4. We'll have the fall of Babylon in chapter 5. And then Daniel in the lion's den in chapter 6. And then chapters 7 through 12 is where it gets fun, because that's when God starts to give Daniel these visions that are quite different than what we've seen before. So chapter 7, we're going to have Daniel's vision of the 4 beasts and the coming kingdom. And chapter 8, Daniel's vision of the ram and the goat. And I believe these chapters go back to when Babylon was still in charge. So 7 and 8 kind of jump back in time. And then chapters 9 through 12 will be under the Medo-Persian rule when he gets these visions. We'll have Daniel's prayer and the 70 weeks. We have Daniel's vision of a man, Daniel's vision of the kings, and then Daniel's final vision. So this is kind of where the book goes and the flow of it. So let's turn back to Daniel chapter 1, and we'll finish up the sermon for tonight, chapter 1. And so the first thing, like for us to notice, is in verse number 2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And so the first thing we see automatically is one of the themes pop out is God's sovereignty, is that this was the Lord's doing. This was no accident. This was no, oops, Babylon got a little too big. Okay, I guess it's expanded. This was God at understanding what was happening the whole entire time. The Lord was in charge and in control, and he never lost control, and nor will he ever lose control over the affairs of men. He is indeed sovereign. No matter what nation it is, no matter how powerful they get, no matter how weak they get, God can raise up a nation, and God can bring a nation down. Nebuchadnezzar would soon learn that it was not him or his God that won. Continuing on in verse 2, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he, that is Nebuchadnezzar, carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and brought the vessels into the treasure of the house of his God. In that day, the main idea was when he went out to battle, it wasn't just the soldiers that were fighting, it was the gods themselves fighting in the heavenly places for their different armies. And so in Nebuchadnezzar's mind and in the Babylonian mind, their God was supreme at that point over all the other nations. And in fact, they would put up the treasures, and it was their trophies that they would put in their temples and in their shrines to show their victories that they were able to do. But little did Nebuchadnezzar know that was not indeed the case, and he will find that out rather quickly and rather personally. But it'll be for the better. It'll be for the better. Next, Daniel and his friends were of royal lineage that were now to serve in the royal court in Babylon. And so here, verse 3 and 4, we see, and the king spake to Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well-favored, skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and as such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And so the best of the best Nebuchadnezzar took with him. He goes, all right, well, Judah doesn't have them anymore. I now have them, and they are now to serve in my court. And they were based, and as we'll see in the next time we meet, we'll see that they are basically making them Babylonian, per se. And so they were now of royal lineage. Now, it's interesting, obviously we read that, and we read in Chronicles and Kings, that they were captured and they were brought there, and then the same in Daniel. What they don't read is that it was a 900-mile journey going around the Arabian desert from Jerusalem all the way up to Babylon that these captors had to endure as they went all the way up there. And as soon as they got up there, of course, they were now basically, and now in the camp of learning how to be a Babylonian and the pressures that soon would ensure. And so we can only imagine what Daniel and his friends went through in their trials leading up to the passages that we get to read. But in between, you can kind of use your imagination at what they had to endure. But it is always the most rewarding to remain faithful to the Lord, and we'll see that in the book of Daniel. We'll end tonight. Turn to one more passage, and that'll be Psalm 2. We'll end tonight in a different book. When you study the different nations and you study different kings, different world leaders, the statements they make and the actions that they take, sometimes it's good to be reminded of Psalm 2. And it says, "Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath and vex them in his sore displeasure. Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son, this day I have begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Be wise now, therefore, O ye kings, Be instructed, ye judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and ye perish from the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that put their trust in him. All right, and we'll end with prayer.